From the very beginning, Anakin Skywalker was never truly welcomed into the Jedi Order as a child in need of guidance. He was tolerated as a prophecy that could not be ignored. When Qui-Gon Jinn placed him before the Council, the discussion did not center on how to raise a traumatized boy torn from his mother. It centered on risk, consequence, and cosmic implication. Anakin was framed not as a person, but as a variable, a disturbance in the Force that required monitoring rather than nurturing. That framing never went away, it simply became quieter and more procedural as the years passed. From that moment on, Anakin existed adjacent to the Order rather than inside it, always slightly apart, always subtly observed, wearing Jedi robes without ever fully inhabiting Jedi belonging. The Council's approval of his training was not an act of faith, it was an act of reluctant concession, and children are far more perceptive to that hesitation than institutions like to admit. They did not say yes because they believed Anakin should be there. They said yes because Qui-Gon died, because prophecy lingered, because refusing would feel like defying the Force itself. That is not acceptance, that is obligation mixed with unease. When authority figures raise you while believing you should not exist in their system, that doubt permeates everything: the tone of instruction, the patience of correction, the limits placed on trust. Anakin was not raised as a chosen student, he was raised on probation, and probation does not end when the subject keeps proving themselves. It ends only when the institution decides it was wrong, something the Council never did. As Anakin grew, the contradiction sharpened, because the Jedi had no hesitation in using his power while withholding their confidence. He was sent into the most dangerous missions, the most aggressive battlefronts, the situations where overwhelming force ability mattered more than deliberation or diplomacy. They trusted his strength, his reflexes, his willingness to throw himself into danger for others, yet they consistently resisted granting him emotional or political responsibility. He was deployed like a weapon, but managed like a liability. Psychologically, that distinction is devastating, because it teaches a person that their value is conditional, tied to output rather than judgment or insight. Anakin learned that he mattered when he was useful, not when he was vulnerable, thoughtful, or uncertain. That is not mentorship, it is instrumentalization, disguised as duty. This imbalance was reinforced by the way the Order elevated Anakin publicly while marginalizing him privately. To the galaxy, he was the hero with no fear, the face of Jedi valor in the Clone Wars, a symbol of hope and decisive action. To the Council, he remained the boy, the chosen one spoken of with unease, the dangerous exception to every rule. That split identity created constant emotional whiplash, because external praise collided with internal constraint. Being celebrated without being trusted does not ground a person, it destabilizes them, because it leaves them unsure which version of themselves is real. Anakin was applauded for his victories, and quietly reminded that he did not fully belong, a contradiction that eroded his sense of self from the inside. Perhaps most damaging of all was the Council's decision to keep Anakin at arm's length from truths that directly shaped his fate. They suspected Palpatine. They sensed the Sith operating at the highest levels of power, and they feared Anakin's closeness to the Chancellor, yet they never treated him as a genuine ally in navigating that danger. Instead of sitting him down and saying, "We trust you, help us understand what we cannot see," they asked him to spy, to observe, to report, without context or transparency. That is not trust, it is surveillance dressed up as responsibility. It communicated clearly that Anakin was close enough to be used but not close enough to be believed. All of this came to a head when the Council denied Anakin the rank of Master, a decision often framed as the spark of his rage, but far more significant as a public declaration of permanent second-class status. By placing him on the Council without granting him full standing, they made their distrust visible and humiliating. It told him, in unmistakable terms, that no amount of service, sacrifice, or loyalty would ever make him equal. This moment did not create his resentment. It crystallized it, confirming every quiet suspicion he had carried since childhood, that he would always be exceptional but never accepted. Institutions rarely realize how loudly their actions speak when they believe they are merely enforcing protocol. The Council's fundamental mistake was consistently interpreting Anakin's emotions as threats rather than signals. Fear, frustration, grief. These were treated as warning signs of corruption instead of invitations to understanding. They did not ask what his anger meant, what it pointed to, or what unmet needs it revealed. They only feared what it might become. But emotions do not become dangerous because they exist. They become dangerous because they are ignored, invalidated, or suppressed until they erupt without language or guidance. The Jedi believed they were preventing darkness by discouraging emotional expression, when in reality they were ensuring it would grow unseen. Compounding this failure was the asymmetry at the heart of their relationship with Anakin, because they demanded vulnerability from him without ever offering it in return. He was expected to confess doubts, surrender attachments, and bear his inner conflicts, while the council remained distant, opaque, and emotionally unavailable. Trust cannot be built in one direction. You cannot demand transparency from someone while shielding yourself behind ritual and silence. The Jedi wanted honesty without intimacy, obedience without belonging, and that imbalance bred isolation rather than loyalty. Anakin learned that openness led to judgment, not support, and adjusted accordingly. This dynamic created the very secrecy the council later condemned, because people do not hide truth out of malice. They hide it when disclosure feels unsafe. If the Jedi had trusted Anakin with truth, he might not have needed Palpatine's counsel. If they had treated him as a partner rather than a problem, he might not have sought validation elsewhere. Palpatine did not win Anakin by being honest, he won him by being attentive, by offering the respect and intellectual engagement the council withheld. The Jedi did not lose Anakin because he hid things from them. He hid things because they never earned the right to know them. What makes the council's distrust of Anakin Skywalker so consequential is that it did not exist in isolation. It was a concentrated expression of a much larger institutional failure that defined the late Republic era. The Jedi Order did not merely struggle to trust Anakin, it struggled to trust change, uncertainty, and emotional complexity itself. Anakin became the focal point for those anxieties because he embodied everything the Order no longer knew how to integrate: raw power without insulation, emotion without ritual distance, attachment without apology. Rather than confronting their own limitations, the Council externalized that discomfort onto him, quietly positioning him as the problem that needed managing rather than the mirror reflecting their decay. This is why the Council's behavior toward Anakin cannot be reduced to caution or wisdom, because true caution involves engagement, dialogue, and adaptive care. What the Jedi practiced instead was risk aversion, a defensive posture designed to preserve institutional stability rather than cultivate individual growth. Anakin was not guided toward maturity, he was constrained away from it. Every withheld truth, every half-granted responsibility, every public honor paired with private suspicion reinforced the same message: that he was too dangerous to trust but too valuable to release. That is not balance, it is containment, and containment breeds pressure rather than resolution. The irony is that the Council believed they were preventing catastrophe by keeping Anakin at arm's length, when in reality they were depriving themselves of the very influence that might have anchored him. Trust is not a reward given after perfection. It is a foundation that allows imperfection to be navigated safely. By refusing to trust Anakin until he became emotionally flawless, the Jedi ensured he would never have the space to become emotionally integrated. They demanded the outcome without providing the conditions that make it possible. This is not a personal failing on Anakin's part. It is a structural contradiction within the Order itself. The Council's emotional distance also distorted Anakin's understanding of authority because it taught him that power and secrecy were inseparable. The Jedi spoke endlessly about transparency, honesty, and surrender, yet modelled none of it in their leadership. Decisions were made behind closed doors, concerns were whispered rather than shared, and truths were rationed according to rank. Anakin learned correctly that those in power did not reveal themselves, they protected themselves. When Palpatine offered openness, conversation, and the illusion of mutual trust, it felt less like manipulation and more like relief. The Council's silence created the vacuum that Palpatine filled. It is also critical to understand that Anakin's anger was not the root problem the Jedi feared. It was the byproduct of prolonged invalidation. Anger emerges when pain has nowhere else to go, when fear is dismissed and grief is treated as weakness. The council consistently responded to Anakin's emotional intensity with correction instead of curiosity, reinforcing the belief that his inner life was unacceptable unless sanitized. Over time, this taught him that authenticity led to rejection, while compliance led only to conditional acceptance. That dynamic fractures identity, forcing a person to split themselves into what is shown and what is hidden, a psychological fault line that Palpatine would later exploit with devastating precision. The refusal to fully integrate Anakin also robbed the Jedi of a chance to evolve, because his presence challenged outdated assumptions about detachment, attachment, and emotional balance. Rather than revisiting doctrine, the Council doubled down on tradition, treating deviation as danger instead of opportunity. In doing so, they protected their philosophy from scrutiny at the cost of relevance. Anakin was not a threat to Jedi ideals, he was a test of whether those ideals could adapt to reality. The Council failed that test by choosing preservation over growth. When Anakin was placed on the Council without being granted the rank of Master, the gesture was meant to assert control, but it instead communicated exclusion with surgical clarity. It publicly confirmed that trust within the Order was hierarchical, conditional, and ultimately unattainable for someone like him. This moment did not merely wound Anakin's pride, it collapsed his remaining belief that the Jedi saw him as a future equal. From that point forward, obedience became obligation rather than conviction, and loyalty became transactional rather than heartfelt. Institutions often underestimate how quickly faith erodes once belonging is denied. The Jedi Council also underestimated how deeply trust functions as a stabilizing force, because they believed a discipline alone could compensate for its absence. Discipline can shape behavior, but it cannot anchor identity. Without trust, Anakin's relationship to the Order became brittle, held together by duty rather than connection. And brittle systems do not bend under stress, they shatter. When faced with the ultimate fear of loss, the Council offered Anakin restraint, patience, and platitudes, never recognizing that what he lacked was not instruction, but reassurance that he mattered beyond his utility. This is why Anakin's fall cannot be understood as a failure of emotional control, because emotional intensity does not doom a person. Alienation does. The Council did not lose Anakin because he was too angry, too fearful, or too attached. They lost him because they never allowed him to feel safe enough to be fully known. Safety precedes honesty, and honesty precedes healing. The Jedi attempted to reverse that order, demanding healing before safety and obedience before trust, and the result was catastrophic. In the final analysis, Anakin's transformation into Darth Vader was not the moment the Jedi failed. It was the moment their long-standing failure became visible. The Order didn't fall because it trusted Anakin too much. It fell because it trusted him too little, projecting its fears onto him until those fears became reality. Anakin was not the exception that broke the system. He was the proof of what the system had already become. The tragedy is not that he turned away from the Jedi, it is that they never truly turned toward him.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.